Well, hello, everybody. I'm Amanda Patterson. I'm your host for today. I am the admin of the wildly popular Facebook group, My Private Practice Tribe. So if you're not already a member, please be sure to join us. And I am the owner of a group practice called Caring Therapists of Broward. I'm located in sunny South Florida, and I am excited to be here today with Genesis Gomez. She is from the South Miami Psychological Group, and we are going to be talking about working with Latinx women and men. I think you work with both, so I'd love to hear all about you and your practice.
Thank you for having me. And yes, I'm excited to talk about this topic because I think that there's stigma about mental health in all communities and just in general, but there's definitely very specific sectors of society where there's more of this stigma, more of kind of the lack of education and also the lack of accessibility. And so I am a bilingual therapist, and I do work with Latinx men and women, children, teenagers. And I definitely see a lot of that. I see a lot of kind of misunderstandings of what the therapeutic process is like, what mental illness, mental wellness are, and even substance abuse and addictions, and just not really understanding what these are, when to look for help, what help looks like, and whether the help is accessible or not.
Yeah, and I think I think a lot of people are familiar with Miami, right? We have a large Hispanic population, Latin population in South Florida. So it would make sense, right, that would be part of your specialty. But what about in areas, I'm curious, like how people in areas maybe where it's not as saturated, but there are populations. You understand, you follow what I mean? Like, not traditional, people know Miami, and, it's not a far stretch to know that you might need to be bilingual in Miami, for instance. Like, how might this look in other areas?
So I think it looks different in some ways, but in other ways it's a little bit similar. So say, for example, someone that's maybe living in Kansas, okay? Someone that is Latinx is living in Kansas. There will be there's actually a somewhat large population of Latinx community in Kansas. However, it's not as diverse as the community that we would have like here in South Florida, especially in Miami, or maybe in a big city like New York or LA. And you're also not seeing that in more of like these countryside, Midwest states or cities. You're not seeing Latinx people like on TV hosting a show or being in the news, being a news anchor. You're not seeing lawyers that are Latinx. You're not probably seeing very few therapists that are also Latinx. So a lot of times people living in some of these other states or some of these other areas are kind of in a very tight, small community. They all kind of work together. They all kind of work for the same companies, kind of same lifestyle, but there's not a lot of diversity. Whereas down here or in other big cities, you will see someone that's Latinx in almost any position, in almost any aspect, different social economic status. So I do think that makes a difference as far as like education wise about therapy, accessibility to therapy, and just having a therapist that also has your background, which obviously is not necessarily for therapy to function unless like language is a barrier. But I as a therapist have worked with clients from a lot of different populations and backgrounds, and know that that's not necessarily essential for that rapport and for that therapeutic relationship to kind of roll and for it to be healing. However, a lot of times people feel like, how can someone that doesn't share my same background, that doesn't understand my colloquialism, that doesn't understand my culture, my tradition, can actually join with me, can actually understand what I'm going through, can actually understand why this situation is so distressing or feels so devastating for me. And so people are more likely to seek help if they feel identified with the person that is providing the help. And so that's where I think the biggest difference is. But even in my experience working down here, and I also worked in Orlando, where there is, again, kind of a significant population, Latinx population, but I would say that it's a lot less than in Miami in comparison. There's still a lot of stigma. There's still a lot of, does this mean that I'm crazy? If I'm going to see a therapist, then that means that I'm crazy. If you're suggesting that, that means that you think that I'm crazy. And so there's definitely still a lot of stigma regardless. And I think a part of it has to do just with the culture. The culture is very family oriented. And so there's this belief that your issues, your problems, they're discussed in the family, and you don't go outside of the family to seek help. You don't go outside of the family to tell what's going on. You wouldn't say that, mom and dad are arguing and it's getting ugly. That's something that you discuss in the family. You would never go outside and say that, unless maybe you were saying it to a priest or to like any form of like religious leader. Because again, the culture is also very religious oriented. So you might be going to a spiritual leader or a spiritual guide to kind of talk about these things. But at that same, from that same point of view, there's so much that a spiritual guide can do when there's actual mental health problems involved.
What are you, because I know that you're doing a lot of, let's call it psychoeducation, a lot of advocacy around breaking down some of these barriers and stigmas. Can you tell us what you're doing and what other people can do in their communities to make mental health more accessible to this population?
So I think that really Facebook and Instagram are just this amazing way of channeling this information to like mass amount of people. Everyone is really on Facebook or on Instagram at this point. So I've been making a lot of like live videos in Spanish, providing information. And I've been sharing kind of little posts that other therapists come up with that are in Spanish that kind of describe the symptoms of major depression, the symptoms of generalized anxiety, the symptoms of PTSD, the symptoms of bipolar disorder. So that information is kind of out there. A lot of times in my videos, I talk about what the process of therapy looks like and what to expect. I think that the big thing is kind of not so much getting them in the door, but getting them to buy in to the trusting the process of therapy. What I've noticed is that a lot of times, they kind of expect to come to that intake session and that you're going to tell them almost like this recipe of what to do. And then they're going to go and do it and they're going to be perfectly fine. And they're not going to ever have to see you again. It's typically what I kind of see, even, with clients that come in to see me. And so it's really being able to explain to them that there's nothing magical that's going to happen in that intake session, that you're just getting to know them and getting to know their history. And they're getting to know you as well and getting to know your style and making sure that you're a good fit. And that from that point on is that you're going to kind of create a strategic plan to kind of help them. But it's going to take time and it's going to take effort. So I really try to put that out there because I don't think it's always that people are not reaching out for help. I think sometimes they do, but they don't know what to expect. And, therapy, I don't like to say that therapy is expensive because I don't think it's expensive at all. I think the money that you invest in yourself is the best that you can ever invest. But a lot of times, Latinx folks don't have the best paying jobs. And have some economic factors that play in. And so if they're taking this money out of, their expenses for the month, like they want to make sure that this money is going to be worth it, basically. And so it's basically trying to explain to them the process so that they understand that I'm not like trying to have them come for 8-9 sessions because I want to make money, but it's the process that it takes for them to see the long-term changes that they want to see.
I think you bring up a big point for a lot of communities other than, let's say, like upper class or upper middle class communities is cost. And that's something that we always have to consider and we always have to look at. I think as therapists, there's a lot of different things that we can do. I totally respect when therapists are completely private pay and they specialize and they provide really good services. I also really respect when therapists, take insurance, right? Because a lot of people have insurance these days with, now everybody's supposed to have insurance and mental health. You're supposed to have mental health with all of the insurance benefits. So most people have insurance benefits. I think it's also educating people about how to appropriately use your insurance benefits. things like, especially for people who work in large companies where you have a PPO plan, most of the time your PPO plan will pay for out-of-network benefits with a therapist that you absolutely love, or somebody who is, let's say, in line with your own culture or values. And so I love that piece about I know you're doing it because I follow you on Instagram, but that advocacy piece and that education piece for people to know, like, there's a lot of different options for therapy. And while it might seem limiting, like maybe you don't have insurance, there are, therapists who offer a sliding scale or will work with certain populations because they're very passionate about it. Or even there's some great community mental health programs out there, especially for targeted populations. So I have a question for you. Are there any directories or any places where people, if they're looking for a Latinx therapist, how would they find that? Because, on Psychology Today, which is the most popular place, I think, at least in South Florida, to find a therapist, you can't really search based on that.
Right.
It's not as easy to search based on that. You can search like bilingual, yes, but, how would somebody find, a therapist more easily? The end.
So Adriana Alejandre is the owner of Latinx Therapist, which basically started as a podcast. She is out there in California. She started this podcast that has gotten a lot of attention from the media. And it's basically doing this, educating, kind of providing advocacy, talking about, for example, parenting styles and what's a spanking, what's like appropriate spanking, if any type of spanking is appropriate, and when does it become abuse, how do you know if that line is being crossed. So kind of topics like this is what she brings into her podcast, and like I said, it's gotten a lot of attention. So the kind of part 2 of that is that she created this directory called Latinx Therapy. And it kind of works out like the same way that Psychology Today is, except that it's just for Latinx therapy. So you can go to your city and see if there's any Latinx therapy that are signed up through this directory. You get some background information on them, on what they, their degree, what they specialize in, kind of their style. You get to see, we get to upload photos. You can get to see some photos from like the office and what the environment looks like. And then you get to connect with them through there as well. You can, send them an email, send you links to their websites, any other directories that they might be on, they can also link. So you definitely get to get a feel for who the therapist is, very similar as in Psychology Today, but it's very specific for Latinx therapy therapists. It will also let you know if they're bilingual, if they speak any other dialect. So you get a lot of information to help you find someone that you feel you can identify with and you can relate with.
And so what would you recommend, let's say for people like me, that I work in South Florida, and I would say at least 50% of my population is, I'm running through, I would say about half are Latinx. And so me personally, I just happen to get like the children of people who migrated, right? Yeah. From Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, wherever, that I get their children in my office, whether their children are, they can be 20s and 30s, or the teenagers that are sort of stuck between two cultures, right? They're stuck between their family of origin culture and the way that they were raised and the way that their families were brought up. But then they're also sort of Americanized because they went to American schools. How could somebody become more culturally competent around working with those communities?
Well, I think number one, and this is probably true for just anyone that comes to anyone's office at any given point, is being curious. And never truly assuming that because you've had experience with other Latinx clients that's going to be similar to what this specific Latinx client is bringing in, because there's a lot of different countries in Latin America, and they all kind of have their own history, they all have their own culture, their own, some things kind of are general, but there's a lot of very specific things to every country. There's also a lot of, different traditions and kind of beliefs in the different countries, different even like slangs and colloquialisms used. So what might be like a perfect phrase to use with one client, say from Colombia, might be a very offensive phrase to use with someone from Nicaragua. So it's just kind of being curious and really not coming from a place of assumption. I think you mentioned something that is really important, and it's depending on whether the person is like first generation, or it's the person that actually immigrated. I think that makes a huge difference. Also, the age makes a huge difference. And so that's where like acculturation comes into play. And so the idea of acculturation is not that the person gives up their original culture and their original traditions, but rather they're able to see the things of it, the aspects of it that they can bring in with them to this new life that they're creating. And then how can they adjust to the majority culture, because they do need to function in the majority culture. Like they need to learn the language if they want to move ahead, if they want to have good jobs, if they want to go to school, like they need to learn the language. They need to learn to observe certain traditions and certain things that happen within the majority culture, but it doesn't mean they need to take in the majority culture 100%. That's not the expectation. And it doesn't mean they need to let go 100% of the original culture. And then even when they're coming here, depending again on where they're living, they might adopt things from other cultures. So say, for example, someone that lives, I don't know if you're familiar with Hialeah, but Hialeah is like a pocket of Miami that is like 99.9% Cuban. So you might have someone coming from Colombia that moves to Hialeah, but they're also going to take in some of that Cuban culture, although that's not the majority culture of the country. It is the majority culture of that specific city where they're living. So they're going to be working most likely with Cuban people. If they're kids, they're going to be going to school with Cuban kids or kids from Cuban parents. And so they're going to take on some of that influence as well. So it's not always two cultures that we're trying to navigate or we're trying to like melt together. Sometimes it can be multiple depending on where you're actually living and who you're surrounding yourself with. And that process of acculturation takes time and it looks different for different people. It's almost like a process of grief, because you're letting go of life as you knew it, to now kind of adjust and kind of melt both of them together into something completely new. And that can be scary and you can feel guilt out of that. And again, the process looks very different for different people. So a lot of times teenagers kind of go through that process of acculturation a lot faster because they're so immersed in the culture, being in school, having all these different kids in school, social media, just TV shows, music. I mean, they get so much exposure full time that a lot of times that process is accelerated for them. Whereas it's not so much for parents, because parents are probably just focused and working, and kind of that's all they know for however old they are. All their lives they've been living in that culture, so it's a little bit more difficult for them to be able to melt and go through the process. And that's where a lot of times we get tensions between family members and what we call that acculturation gap. So when I work with families that have this acculturation gap, it's really helping them understand that what the process looks like, that is normal to have these different feelings and overwhelming feelings from time to time. Like I said, grief, guilt, anger, excitement, hopefulness, optimism, all these contrasting feelings are part of that process. And it's very normal to go through them. And it's also normal that you're not going at the same pace that your child is going, or you're not even going at the same pace that your husband or your wife or your significant other might be going.
I think that's such an important point, that it goes back to what we learn in graduate school, is like to treat each individual as an individual and not make too many assumptions and don't group people too much together, and really to be present with each person's process as they're experiencing it. So thank you. I think this was wildly helpful for me, and I know it's going to be helpful for other people. How can people find you on Instagram? I know you're doing really great things on there. So can you tell people how to follow you?
Yes, thank you. So you can find me as the Miami Therapist.
What a great handle. You got so lucky to be able to get that. I'm
right?
like, yeah, that's so great. Yeah. And so I will be putting information in the show notes as well, and how to get in contact with her, website, email address, and some information. So thank you so much for being a part of our video series. And a couple of notes for those of you watching: please be sure to like and subscribe, like the video and subscribe to this YouTube channel so that way you can see more videos on private practice building. And a special thank you to our sponsor, Therapy Notes. If you are looking for an electronic health record that is full service, that can do billing, you can do notes, you can do treatment plans, you can do text and email reminders, you definitely want to check out Therapy Notes. You can find them at www.therapynotes.com. And if you use the promo code Amanda, my name, you can get 2 months free. So thank you everybody for watching, and thank you Genesis for being a part of our video today.
Thank you for having me.